Whose child is that?
His.
Give me my son.
Controlling the city's underworld was easy. Quieting a frantic infant was impossible. When the Mafia Don's screaming air shattered the suffocating, heavily armed wedding, the congregation froze in absolute terror. Everyone, except the cynical maid of honor. She didn't just step out of line. She crossed a deadly, irreversible boundary. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross smelled like floor wax, ancient dust, and a suffocating quantity of imported white lilies. It was the kind of smell that stuck to the back of your throat, sweet and decaying all at once. Tessa stood at the altar, her spine rigid against the chill of the drafty stone apse, trying to ignore the sharp, pinching ache in her left heel. The blush-pink satin heels Chloe had chosen for her were a half-size too small, a minor torture in a room full of major ones. Tessa hated weddings. She especially hated this one. She looked out over the pews, 400 guests. On the left side, Chloe's family, teachers, accountants, mid-level insurance adjusters, huddled together like a flock of nervous sparrows. They wore their rented tuxedos and pastel dresses with stiff, terrified posture. On the right side sat the real reason the cathedral was locked down by men with coiled earpieces, Declan Russo's side. They didn't look like movie gangsters. There were no fedoras, no obvious scars. They looked like hedge fund managers. Tailored Italian wool, silk ties, heavy Rolexes catching the stained glass light. But the air around them was dense. It felt bruised. Tessa could smell the expensive Oud cologne radiating from the front rows, masking the metallic, ozone scent of concealed firearms. Chloe, standing 3 feet away, was vibrating. The heavy silk of her bespoke gown rustled with every microscopic tremor of her knees. She looked like a porcelain doll about to be dropped on concrete. Tessa tightened her grip on her bouquet, the damp stems bleeding green sap against her palms. She wanted to grab Chloe by her lace-covered wrist, drag her down the marble steps, and run. But you didn't run from Declan Russo. Declan stood facing the altar, his profile sharp and unyielding. He wasn't a large man, but he possessed a gravitational pull that made the cavernous cathedral feel cramped. His dark hair was meticulously groomed, his jaw set like carved granite. He looked less like a groom and more like a king overseeing an execution. And then there was the baby. In the first pew on the right, barricaded by men whose shoulders strained the seams of their jackets, sat a terrified-looking woman in a gray uniform. On her lap was an 8-month-old boy in a miniature velvet tuxedo, Lucas, the product of Declan's first marriage, a union that had ended in a spray of bullets outside a high-end restaurant 2 years ago. Tessa watched the nanny's white-knuckled grip on the baby's waist. The church was too quiet. The priest, a brittle man with a tremor in his voice, was droning on in Latin. The acoustics of the vaulted ceiling amplified the low, guttural clearing of throats from the Mafia side. The baby squirmed. It started as a wet, clicking sound in the back of the infant's throat, a small protest. The nanny stiffened, instantly bouncing her knee in a jerky, panicked rhythm. Tessa felt a pulse of annoyance throb behind her left eye. She had a lingering hangover from the sterile, joyless bachelorette dinner the night before, and her patience was already worn to a thin, frayed wire. Just give him a bottle, Tessa thought, watching the nanny fumble with a heavily monogrammed diaper bag. But the baby didn't want a bottle. The velvet tuxedo looked stiff, the bow tie cutting into the soft, fat folds of his neck. The stained glass above threw a heavy beam of red light directly onto the child's face, baking him in the humid, floral-choked air of the church. The squirming turned into a sharp, reedy whine. Declan's broad shoulders twitched, just a fraction of an inch. He didn't turn around. He didn't even shift his weight. But the temperature in the room plummeted. Tessa saw the underboss, a man named Vincent, whose eyes looked like flat, dead pennies, lean over and whisper something to the nanny. The nanny looked as if she were about to weep. She shoved a rubber pacifier against the baby's mouth. The baby spat it out. It hit the marble floor with a sharp times, clack times, that echoed like a gunshot. Tessa's toes curled in her tight shoes. The air in the cathedral grew thick, heavy with the collective breath-holding of 400 people. The Latin chanting faltered for a second, as the priest glanced nervously over his reading glasses. Chloe stopped vibrating. She just went perfectly, unnaturally still. She didn't look at the baby. She stared straight ahead at the gold crucifix, a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. Then, the baby inhaled. It was a long, ragged draw of air that expanded his small chest against the velvet confines of his suit. Tessa knew what was coming. She braced herself, her fingernails biting into her palms. The first scream tore through the church like tearing metal. It wasn't a normal cry. It was a visceral, eardrum-piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated infant rage. The sound hit the stone columns, bounced up to the 70-foot vaulted ceiling, and cascaded back down in overlapping waves of noise. Wow! Tessa squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second. The hangover thudded against her skull in perfect time with the baby's wails. The nanny stood up, her face flushed dark red, and started pacing the narrow space between the front pew and the altar steps. She bounced the child violently, patting his back with an open, trembling palm. "Hush! Hush! Piccolo! Please!" she hissed, her voice cracking. The baby arched his back, throwing his heavy head backward, his face turning a deep, mottled purple. He kicked his legs, the tiny leather dress shoes thumping against the nanny's chest. The screams escalated into breathless, high-pitched squeals. Tessa opened her eyes and watched the power dynamic of the room unravel. These were men who orchestrated dock strikes, who laundered millions through offshore accounts, who broke fingers without blinking, and they were entirely paralyzed by an 8-month-old. Vincent, the dead-eyed underboss, stood up. He loomed over the nanny, his large hands hovering uselessly. He looked furious, but underneath the fury, Tessa saw something pathetic. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't shoot the noise. He couldn't bribe it. He barked something in Italian at the nanny, stepping into her space. The nanny shrank back, bumping into the wooden pew. The baby, sensing the sharp spike of adrenaline and aggression in the air, somehow found a higher octave. "Whoa, Declan," Chloe whispered. Her voice was a fragile, papery thread. Declan finally turned. The movement was slow, deliberate. The priest fell completely silent. The entire right side of the church went rigid. Declan looked at the screaming child. There was no warmth in his dark eyes, no paternal instinct kicking in to soothe his flesh and blood. There was only cold, calculating irritation. He looked at the baby, the same way he probably looked at a subordinate who had skimmed off the top of a shipment. "Take him out," Declan said. His voice didn't echo. It was low, gravelly, but it cut straight through the noise. The nanny scrambled, clutching the thrashing, screaming infant to her chest, trying to gather the diaper bag at the same time. But in her blind panic, the strap of the bag caught on the heavy oak armrest of the pew. She yanked. The bag flipped, spilling a barrage of plastic bottles, wipes, and a tin of formula across the marble floor. The metal tin rolled lazily across the aisle, coming to a stop against Declan's polished black shoe. The baby was choking on his own spit now, coughing and screaming in a terrifying loop. The nanny dropped to her knees, sobbing, trying to scrape the items back into the bag with one hand while holding the convulsing baby with the other. Vincent reached down, grabbing the nanny by the upper arm with a brutal grip, hauling her upward. "Move," he snarled. Tessa watched it all from the altar. She felt a cold, hard knot forming in her stomach. It wasn't heroics. She didn't have a bleeding heart. She was 28, working a dead-end job in commercial real estate, and her defining personality trait was usually a healthy dose of apathy. But right now, the sheer incompetence of it all grated on her nerves. The absolute, toxic stupidity of these terrifying men. They were treating a suffocating, overheated infant like a live grenade. Chloe was crying silently now. A single tear cut through her heavy airbrushed makeup. She looked at Tessa, pleading, utterly helpless. Tessa looked at the baby. He was suffocating in that velvet suit. His neck was arched at a painful angle because the terrified nanny was holding him too tight, treating him like a fragile piece of contraband rather than a human being. The screaming was drilling into Tessa's brain, scraping against the inside of her skull. "Screw it," Tessa thought. She lowered her bouquet. The heavy arrangement of white roses and damp greenery hit the marble step with a wet, heavy thud. The sound was nothing compared to the baby's screams, but the movement caught the eye of the guards. 3 men in the front row subtly reached their hands inside their jackets. Tessa didn't look at them. She hiked up the heavy satin skirt of her maid of honor dress, exposing the pale pink heels, and walked down the altar steps. "Tessa," Chloe choked out, a warning hiss. Tessa ignored her. Her heels clicked sharply against the stone. She didn't hurry. She walked with the tired, heavy gait of a woman who just wanted the noise to stop. As she reached the aisle, Vincent stepped into her path. He was a wall of solid muscle and expensive tailoring. He smelled of stale tobacco and peppermints. "Get back up there, sweetheart," Vincent said, his voice a low, vibrating threat. He didn't pull a weapon, but the way his body angled toward her was designed to intimidate, to crush her back into her designated, subservient place. Tessa didn't stop. She didn't slow down. She looked up into Vincent's dead eyes, feeling the ridiculousness of her pink dress and the blister on her heel. And she shoved him. She didn't push him hard. She couldn't have moved him if she tried, but she planted her hand flat against his sternum and shoved him just enough to make him instinctively shift his weight off balance. "Move, you oversized ape," Tessa said, her voice flat, stripped of any deference or fear. Vincent's eyes widened in genuine shock. For a second, his brain couldn't process the audacity. A civilian, a woman, touching a made man. In that split second of his confusion, Tessa slid past him. She reached the nanny. The poor woman was a shivering mess, her arms locked rigidly around the screaming baby. "Give him to me," Tessa said. The nanny stared at her with wild, wet eyes, shaking her head frantically. She looked past Tessa, toward Declan, terrified of making the wrong move. Tessa didn't wait for permission. She reached out and wedged her arms between the nanny's chest and the baby. It wasn't a gentle taking. It was a firm, unquestionable extraction. She pulled the heavy, thrashing infant into her own arms. The immediate sensory impact of the child was overwhelming. The baby was boiling hot. His small body was drenched in sweat, the velvet jacket soaked through at the armpits. He felt rigid, every muscle locked in a frantic spasm of distress. His breath smelled like sour milk and panicked exertion. Tessa shifted him, turning him away from the harsh glare of the stained glass and the suffocating wall of men. She rested his damp forehead against the bare skin of her collarbone. "Shh," she murmured, but not in the frantic, pleading way the nanny had. It was an annoyed, grounding sound, a command, not a request. She didn't bounce him. She didn't pat him. She just held him firmly, applying deep, even pressure against his back. With her free hand, she reached up to the baby's collar. Her fingers found the stiff, pre-tied bow tie digging into his carotid artery. She yanked it. The cheap clasp snapped, and she tossed the bow tie onto the marble floor. Then, she found the top 3 buttons of the miniature dress shirt. They were tight, pinning the thick velvet lapels against his throat. She popped them open, ripping the thread on the bottom one. She shoved the heavy velvet jacket off his shoulders, letting it hang loose, exposing his clammy, overheated skin to the cool draft of the cathedral. The baby gasped, a ragged, shuddering intake of air. The sudden release of pressure and heat shocked him. Tessa pressed her hand flat against the center of his chest, feeling the wild, rabbit-fast thumping of his heart. "Breathe, kid," she muttered into his damp hair. "It's just a bunch of guys in cheap suits. Nothing to cry over." The piercing shriek broke into a series of wet, heavy hiccups. The silence that followed was louder than the screaming. The heavy acoustics of the cathedral absorbed the sudden lack of noise, leaving only the sound of 400 people realizing they had forgotten to exhale. Tessa kept her hand flat on the baby's chest, her thumb resting just under his chin. He let out a long, exhausted sigh, a bubble of spit forming at the corner of his mouth. He drooped against her, the fight completely draining out of his small limbs. His wet cheek stuck to her collarbone. Only then did Tessa look up. She turned her head, her chin resting lightly against the top of the baby's sweaty head, and met Declan Russo's eyes. He was standing less than 2 feet away now. He had closed the distance while she was unbuttoning the child's clothes. Up close, the danger radiating off him wasn't an abstract concept. It was a physical weight in the air. She could see the faint razor burn on his neck. She could see the microscopic flecks of gold in his dark, predatory eyes. None of his men were moving. Vincent was still standing behind Tessa, frozen, likely waiting for a nod from his boss to drag her out of the church by her hair. Declan looked at the baby, now slumped in a boneless, exhausted stupor against Tessa's chest. Then, he looked at Tessa. He didn't look angry. That was the terrifying part. If he had been scowling, if his jaw had been tight with rage, it would have made sense. It would have been human. Instead, his expression was completely blank. His eyes moved over her face, tracking the pulse beating at the base of her throat, taking in the cheap, tight dress, the messy bun that was coming undone, the defiant, exhausted set of her jaw. He was dissecting her. "You tore his jacket," Declan said. The voice was smooth, quiet, carrying the dangerous hum of a high-voltage wire. Tessa didn't blink. The hangover headache was still there, a dull throb behind her eyes, wiping out whatever self-preservation instinct she should have had. "He was roasting to death, you idiot," Tessa said. The collective gasp from the right side of the church sounded like the ocean pulling back before a tsunami. Chloe let out a tiny, stifled squeak from the altar. Tessa didn't care. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, clear irritation. You put an infant in a velvet straitjacket, sit him in front of a space heater, and then you're surprised when he loses his mind? He's a baby, not a prop. She felt Vincent shift his weight behind her, the scrape of leather on marble. Declan didn't look at Vincent. He didn't break eye contact with Tessa. He reached out slowly. His hand was large, the knuckles rough, scarred in a way that contradicted his immaculate suit. He didn't reach for Tessa's neck or her arm. He reached for the baby. His large hand settled over the back of the child's head. His thumb brushed against Tessa's collarbone. His skin was incredibly hot, rough against her skin. A sharp, involuntary shiver ran down her spine, a purely physical reaction to the proximity of a predator. Declan's eyes flickered slightly at the shiver, a dark amusement flashing deep in the pupils. "Give him to me," Declan said softly. Tessa hesitated. The baby whimpered in his sleep at the shift in movement. She could have handed him over easily. She should have. But the stubborn, contrary part of her soul flared up. "No," Tessa said, shifting her weight, adjusting the baby higher on her hip. "He just fell asleep. You take him now, he wakes up, and we do this all over again." "I'm not listening to that for another 20 minutes. Declan's hand remained suspended in the air for a second, before he slowly lowered it to his side. The amusement in his eyes crystallized into something sharper, something far more intense. It was the look of a man who had expected a sheep and found a wolf staring back at him. "The ceremony," Tessa said, gesturing toward the altar with a nod of her head. "Finish it. I'll hold him." She turned her back on the most dangerous man in the city. It was a suicidal move. She felt the target on her spine, the sheer disbelief radiating from the armed men behind her. She walked back up the marble steps, her heels clicking softly. She didn't pick up her bouquet. She simply walked back to her spot, next to the trembling, pale bride, rocking the Mafia air gently against her chest. She turned around to face the congregation. She locked eyes with Declan Russo again. Declan stared at her for a long, stretching moment. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a smile. It was an acknowledgement. He turned his back to her, facing the priest. "Continue," he commanded. The priest swallowed audibly, his hands shaking as he picked up his holy book. The ceremony resumed, but the air in the cathedral had fundamentally changed. The suffocating fear had been punctured. Tessa stood there, her feet aching, her head pounding, holding a sleeping infant who smelled of sour milk and expensive velvet. She watched the back of Declan Russo's neck as he repeated his vows to Chloe. She realized, with a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, that she had just made a terrible mistake. She hadn't just quieted a baby. She had made herself interesting to a man who destroyed everything he found interesting. The reception was held at a sprawling estate in the hills, a fortress of limestone and black iron masquerading as a private residence. Inside, the grand ballroom was a masterclass in suffocating opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the frescoed ceiling, casting fractured, icy light over a sea of aggressively expensive floral centerpieces. The air was thick with the warring scents of roasted lamb, spilled champagne, and the heavy, sweet smoke of imported cigars drifting in from the terrace. Tessa sat at the far edge of the head table, her posture slouched in a way that ruined the elegant lines of her blush-pink dress. Beneath the floor-length silk tablecloth, she had finally kicked off the agonizing heels, her bare feet pressed into the plush, overly thick carpet. The blister on her left heel was weeping, a raw, burning sting that grounded her amidst the surreal, buzzing nightmare of the evening. She stared down at her glass of bourbon. She had ditched the polite champagne toasts an hour ago. The amber liquid tasted like smoke and wood, burning a clean, hot path down her throat. She needed it. The adrenaline from the cathedral had long since burned out, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. A few seats down, Chloe sat rigid beside her new husband. The bride looked spectacular, a vision of lace and diamonds, but she was breaking apart at the seams. Tessa could see the microscopic tremors in Chloe's hands as she held her fork, the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. She was drinking heavily, tossing back flutes of vintage champagne with a desperate, frantic rhythm. Declan didn't seem to notice his bride's quiet deterioration. Or, more likely, he didn't care. He sat in his high-backed chair with the relaxed, sprawling, predatory grace of a man who owned the room and everyone in it. He spoke in low murmurs to the men who approached the table to pay their respects. Men with thick necks and expensive tailoring, who kissed his cheek and looked at Chloe with empty, calculating smiles. Every so often, Declan's gaze would drift down the long table. It would bypass the weeping bride, bypass the towering cake, and lock onto Tessa. It wasn't a gaze of longing or romantic interest. It was the cold, analytical stare of a watchmaker examining a strange, new gear that had somehow fallen into his perfectly ordered machine. Every time those dark eyes found hers, the fine hairs on Tessa's arms stood up. She would take another swallow of bourbon, stubbornly refusing to look away first, letting the hostility radiate off her in a silent, jagged wave. The uneasy truce of the dinner service shattered when the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. An older woman, dressed in severe black silk, walked in. She had a face like a hatchet, and the grim, unyielding posture of a lifelong enforcer. In her arms, she held Lucas. The velvet jacket was gone, replaced by a soft cotton sleepsuit, but the baby's face was already flushed, his lower lip trembling. The heavy thrum of the bass from the live band echoed off the marble floor. It was a loud, chaotic environment, entirely unsuited for an overtired infant. Tessa watched as the older woman brought the child to the head table. She leaned down, whispering harshly into Declan's ear. Declan didn't look at the woman. He looked at the baby. Lucas let out a short, miserable wail, squirming against the woman's tight grip. Tessa felt the muscles in her neck tighten. "Don't do it," she told herself. "Look away. Drink your bourbon, not your circus, not your monkeys." She took a slow breath, forcing her eyes down to the rim of her crystal glass. She traced the etched glass with her thumb, feeling the sharp ridges. "Tessa." The voice cut through the noise of the ballroom like a scalpel. It wasn't loud, but the acoustic weight of it commanded total silence from the immediate vicinity. The men, standing near the table, stopped talking. Chloe froze, her champagne flute halfway to her mouth. Tessa looked up. Declan was staring at her. He didn't gesture. He didn't ask. He simply held her gaze and tilted his head a fraction of an inch toward the crying baby. It was a test. A raw, naked display of authority. He wanted to see if the defiance in the church had been a fluke of adrenaline, or if she was truly foolish enough to stand her ground. Tessa felt a hot flash of pure, unadulterated anger pool in her stomach. She looked at the older woman, who was holding Lucas awkwardly, trying to shush him over the booming bass of a jazz cover band. The kid was miserable. His tiny hands were balled into fists, rubbing furiously at his swollen eyes. Tessa slammed her glass down. The heavy crystal cracked against the table, a sharp, ringing sound. She stood up. She didn't bother fishing for her shoes. She walked barefoot across the dais, the silk of her dress dragging silently over the carpet. She could feel the eyes of every Maid man, every guard, every terrified relative tracking her movement. She stopped in front of Declan. She didn't look at him. She looked at the older woman. "Give him here," Tessa muttered, her voice rough with fatigue. The woman bristled, pulling the baby back slightly, looking to Declan for permission. Declan gave a barely perceptible nod. Declan. Tessa took the boy. The moment Lucas's chest hit hers, he let out a shuddering breath, his tiny hands grabbing fists of her blush-pink silk dress. He buried his wet, snotty face into the curve of her neck. He smelled like baby powder and exhausted tears. Tessa adjusted her grip, supporting his heavy head. She finally looked down at Declan. "You people are unbelievable," she said, her voice barely a whisper, meant only for him. "He needs a dark room and silence, not a mob convention." Declan's jaw ticked. The faint, dangerous amusement returned to his eyes, a dark spark in the pitch black. "Then find him one," Declan replied softly. Tessa turned on her heel, the damp hem of her dress swishing around her bare ankles, and walked out of the ballroom. She pushed through the heavy side doors, desperate for the cool, quiet air of the estate's sprawling hallways. She didn't know the layout of the house, but she followed the dimming lights, moving away from the throbbing bass and the clinking glasses. She found a long, carpeted corridor lined with dark, imposing oil paintings. The air here smelled of lemon polish and old paper. It was blissfully quiet. She paced. She kept her steps slow and rhythmic, rubbing smooth circles into the center of Lucas's back. The baby's breathing leveled out, deepening into the heavy, rattling sighs of a child plunging into deep sleep. Tessa let her own head fall back against the cool silk wallpaper, closing her eyes. Her feet throbbed. Her head pounded. She just wanted to go home to her terrible studio apartment, eat cold takeout, and forget this family existed. "You have a terrible habit of turning your back on people, Tessa." The voice came from the shadows at the end of the hall. Tessa's eyes snapped open. Her breath hitched, catching painfully in her throat. Declan Russo stepped out of the gloom. He had discarded his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the silk tie hanging loose. Without the armor of the jacket, he looked larger, his shoulders impossibly broad in the narrow, dim corridor. He walked toward her. His footsteps made absolutely no sound on the thick carpet. Tessa didn't back away. She couldn't. Her bare heels were already pressed against the baseboard. She tightened her arms around the sleeping baby, a biological shield she knew was utterly useless against a man like this. Declan stopped, 2 feet away. The ambient temperature in the hallway seemed to plummet, yet the heat radiating from his body was palpable, a dense, heavy warmth. The smell of him oozed clean sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of the cold night air overwhelmed the lemon polish. "Shouldn't you be cutting a cake?" Tessa asked. She aimed for bored, but her voice came out slightly hoarse, lacking its usual cynical bite. "Vincent is handling it," Declan said. He didn't look at the baby. He kept his eyes locked on her face, mapping the shadows under her eyes, the smudge of mascara on her cheekbone. "Delegating your own wedding reception," Tessa muttered. "Classy." Declan took half a step closer. The proximity was a physical pressure, suffocating and deliberate. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" The question wasn't asked with ego. It was a genuine inquiry, delivered with the flat, clinical tone of a scientist, observing an anomaly. Tessa swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "I am afraid of you. I'm just more tired than I am scared. And frankly, your parenting offends me more than your rap sheet." Declan's eyes narrowed. He lifted a hand. Tessa flinched, an involuntary, microscopic tightening of her shoulders. But he didn't strike her. His large, rough hand bypassed her neck entirely. He reached up, his knuckles grazing the sensitive skin just beneath her ear, and pulled a loose, fallen strand of hair away from her face, tucking it behind her ear. The touch was electric. It wasn't gentle. The calluses on his fingers scraped against her skin, leaving a trail of hot, stinging awareness in their wake. It was a fiercely possessive gesture, a claim staked in the middle of a dimly lit hallway. Tessa's breath stopped. She stared up at him, her heart hammering a frantic, bird-like rhythm against her ribs. She could feel the pulse in his wrist where his hand lingered near her jaw. It was slow, steady. "My wife is terrified of me," Declan said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that settled in Tessa's bones. "She shakes when I look at her. She drinks to numb the panic. She agreed to this marriage because her father owed me a debt he couldn't pay in cash." Tessa felt a sickening jolt of pity for Chloe, mixed with a sudden, terrifying clarity. "So, you bought her." "I secured an asset," Declan corrected smoothly, his thumb dropping to trace the line of Tessa's jaw. "But an asset that shatters under pressure is a liability. This world." He gestured vaguely to the walls around them, to the empire he controlled. "It doesn't tolerate fragility. It eats it." Tessa stood perfectly still. The baby was a heavy, warm weight against her chest, anchoring her. But she felt entirely adrift. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you didn't shatter," Declan said. His dark eyes were devoid of mercy, stripping her down to her absolute core. "Today, in that church, surrounded by men who kill for a living, you didn't look at me with fear. You looked at me with contempt." "It wasn't a compliment," Tessa shot back, her voice shaking slightly now. The adrenaline was back, cold and sharp. "It was honesty," Declan replied. "A very rare commodity in my life." He finally dropped his hand, stepping back, instantly taking the suffocating heat with him. Tessa felt a bizarre, shameful pang of loss at the absence of his touch, a dark, internal contradiction that made her stomach churn. "The baby is asleep," Declan noted, glancing down at Lucas for the first time. The child was completely limp, his mouth slightly open against Tessa's silk dress. "Yes," Tessa said, defensive. "So I'm going to put him in a crib, and then I am calling a cab, and I am going back to my life." Declan let out a low, dark chuckle. It was a sound devoid of humor. It sent a fresh chill down her spine. "Your life," he repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. He reached into the pocket of his slacks and pulled out a heavy, matte black phone. "You work as an assistant property manager for a firm in the garment district. You make $42,000 a year. You are 3 months behind on your student loans, and your landlord is threatening eviction over a plumbing dispute you didn't cause." Tessa's blood ran cold. The numbness in her feet vanished, replaced by a deep, icy terror. "You ran a background check on me?" "I run background checks on everyone in my perimeter," Declan said flatly. "But I paid special attention to yours during the cocktail hour." He took a step backward, merging slightly with the shadows of the corridor. The immaculate grooming and the expensive clothes couldn't hide the brutal, violent truth of what he was. He wasn't a businessman. He was a warlord. "There's a room at the end of this hall. Second door on the left," Declan instructed, his tone shifting back to absolute command. "A crib is set up. Put my son down." "And then?" Tessa demanded, her voice rising, the panic finally breaking through her cynical veneer. "What happens then?" Declan paused. The dim light caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone, the cold deadliness of his eyes. "Then," Declan said softly, "you are going to go into the room next to it, and you are going to go to sleep. Your apartment lease has been terminated. Your debts have been cleared. Your things will be moved here by tomorrow morning." Tessa shook her head, a violent, desperate denial. No, you can't do that. I'm not a part of this. I'm just the maid of honor." "You times were times the maid of honor," Declan corrected. The shadow of a cruel, fascinating smile played on his lips. "When you crossed my men at the altar, you inserted yourself into my ledger. You showed me that you have the spine my wife lacks. and I protect my son above all things. I am not your nanny, she hissed, gripping the baby tighter. No, Declan agreed, his eyes darkening into something that made the air completely vanish from the hallway. You aren't. But you belong to this house now. He didn't wait for her to respond. He didn't need to. He turned and walked back toward the booming bass of the reception, leaving Tessa standing alone in the dark corridor, holding the sleeping heir to an empire, entirely trapped in a cage she had locked herself inside. Tessa thought she was just surviving a wedding, but she accidentally signed her own life away to the city's most dangerous don. What did you think of Declan's brutal claim in the hallway? Drop a comment below if you think Tessa will find a way out, or if she's destined to rule by his side. If you want to see how this intense dynamic, make sure to like this video, share it, and hit that subscribe button